Okay, we're going to get started. Hello. I'm Sarah Whiting, I'm the Dean. And before we start, let me draw your attention to a couple programs we have upcoming at the GSD. So this Thursday, we'll be kicking off the 5th Annual Mayor's Institute on City Design Just City Mayoral Fellowship, that's a mouthful, with a panel discussion on design and planning strategies that address racial, social, and environmental injustice. And then the following Thursday, February 13th, this year's Kenzo Tange design critic in architecture, Dorte Mandrup, will deliver a lecture entitled Conditions of Place and Form. For more information and to see the full lineup of presenters, please visit the GSD's website. So tonight's lecture is made possible by the Aga Khan program dedicated to studying Islamic art, architecture, urbanism, landscape design, and conservation here at the GSD. And I'm delighted that this evening's speaker is Professor Souleymane Bachir Diagne, who is a professor of philosophy and francophone studies at Columbia University and the director of the Institute of African Studies. So these three platforms already hint at Souleymane's extraordinary intellectual elasticity, but wait, there's more. Souleymane attended the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, where, if I'm not mistaken, you were the first Senegalese student there, is that correct? And where you studied under Althusser and Derrida, so you can see, Michael, why I suggested that you come. And he focused on the philosophy of science. His doctoral work, completed at the Sorbonne, was in mathematics, specifically on the British mathematician George Boole's Algebra of Logic. In addition to publishing a biography of Boole, beautifully entitled and roughly translated Boole, Night Owl in Broad Daylight, Souleymane's books in English include, among others, Open to Reason, Muslim Philosophers in Conversation with the Western Tradition, and African Art as Philosophy, Senghor, Bergson, and the Idea of Negritude. His book, From Language to Language, The Hospitality of Translation, will soon appear in English. And remind me again the name of the press? By Other Press. Judith is here to underscore that fact as his publisher, as will his recent essay, Universalism, Humanity by Means of Humanity, or however they will discover how to translate that title, which is very important. So in short, it's not surprising at all that Souleymane has 3 departmental homes at Columbia, for it's actually really impossible to fit him into a single cubbyhole. His work speaks to everyone at a university, certainly to everyone here at the GSD, and I would venture to everyone in the world. For his thesis of his most recent work is that of a horizontal universal. I love how that's spatialized. That is to say, and I quote him from an interview that appeared a few years ago in Le Monde, a universal that is not dictated by a supposed center of a world, an imposed singularity, in other words, but a horizontal universal, such that cultures and languages that meet and converge produce it together. In today's world, filled with economic and social inequities and environmental catastrophes, this idea of the universal underscores our shared human condition. For Souleymane, translation is a perfect analogy for this project of the horizontal universal. Translation, as he says, is the search for a global public space. So again, you're using terminology that speaks well in this building, where there is argumentation and exchange despite misunderstandings or the untranslatable. On a personal note, I've had the great pleasure of working closely with Souleymane on the Aga Khan Award Steering Committee, and I know few others who so beautifully personify what our shared humanity should be. We're very, very lucky to have him with us this evening. Thank you, Souleymane, for coming and speaking with us.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you all for being here. I hope you like the music that you listen to, because I'm responsible for that. I was asked to select a few songs, and I selected some by Touré Kunda, which is a great group from my country, Senegal. And I would start also by extending my warmest thanks to Sarah Whiting, who took the initiative of inviting me. As you have heard, for many years now, Sarah and I have shared a common reflection on the question of the universal of humanism, as we are both members of the steering committee of the Aga Khan Prize for Architecture. And the intellectual complicity that you have felt in her generous introduction that has thus developed between the two of us is really extremely precious to me. And I would also like to thank everybody who made my visit possible, thank the Graduate School of Design, thank the Aga Khan program, Sarah. So I understood that there is Sarah R, as you are Sarah W. Okay, Sarah R, Matt, and Raquel, who were very helpful with my visit here. And as I said, and following Sarah's introduction, my work revolves very much around the question of universalism and humanism. So as I like to say, I am very passé in that sense. I do still believe in universalism and humanism, and I believe that this is a time when we need indeed to believe in that, because the other term of the alternative is just skepticism and cynicism. So this is why when I was appointed to the chair du Louvre for 2024, as you may know, the Louvre selects every year, nominates someone to be the chair du Louvre, and that means you give 5 lectures, and then you, oh my goodness, sorry. And then you turn those 5 lectures into a book. So when I was invited, I chose the following question as the theme for the 5 lectures I was asked to give between November and December. Le Louvre, quels universels? The Louvre, which universals? And for me, asking such a question was a way of reading the Universal Museum, that is the Louvre, from the perspective of the departments that have recently been added to it, and which raise anew the question of the meaning of this museum's universalism. The departments in question are le pavillon des sessions, the pavilion of sessions, so called because the French Parliament used to hold its sessions in the building, especially during the Second Empire. The pavilion today is home of artworks from pre-Columbian Americas, Africa, Oceania, and a little bit of Asia. And the other department that had been recently added to the Louvre is the department called Arts of Islam. So this was my approach to these 5 lectures I was invited to give. I wanted to read the Louvre from the standpoint, from the perspective of those departments that had been added, and added to a museum that is defined as a universal museum. What does it mean to add the particularisms of Africa, Oceania, Asia to the universalism or the proclaimed universalism of the Louvre? So in proposing the Louvre, which universals are the title of my 5 lectures, I have simply included my own questions in those that the museum itself has asked, especially over the last 25 years, which have been marked by events that have raised questions about the meaning to be given to the museum universal or not, encyclopedic or not character. These events include the opening of the Pavillon des Sessions to the public on April 19, 2000, followed by that of Art of Islam department, so the 2 departments I have mentioned earlier, plus the declaration that was signed by the directors of major institutions on the importance and value of Universal Museums. This was published in 2004. I could add as other important events the creation of Louvre Abu Dhabi in 2017. What does it mean to create a museum such as the Louvre in a place like Abu Dhabi in 2017? And what does it say about universalism? And last but not least, the exhibition at Louvre Lens, which is Lens being another city in France. So because of all these different events, so-called universal museums are raising questions about their own nature today, their own character. And in addition to that, you can have also the question of restitution. Anytime you talk about African art, obviously, today, the question of restitution of the African arts to Africa is posed and, and raised. So my lectures have therefore consisted in translating the philosophical reflection I have been conducting for over the last few years on the notion of the universal into the terms of today's questioning of the meaning of this concept by so-called universal museums. I will focus, of course, on the Musée du Louvre because that is the one I know best. But what I'm saying is also relevant for a museum such as the Metropolitan Museum as well. And I'm fortunate to have in that Met Museum a friend of mine, Alisa Lagama, who is the head of the African art section of the museum. So, as I say now, my task is to turn the lectures into a book, and it appeared to me that this prestigious graduate school of design would be the ideal place and audience for me to present what I intend to write as the introduction to that book. So that is what I'm presenting here. So my question as I approach the lectures was about universalism. The philosophical moment we are living through, which is a post-colonial moment, is a moment of radical questioning of universalism as inherently Western, colonial, imperial. So that is the starting point, the idea that we live a post-colonial moment, which means that we are in a time of decolonization, obviously, but also that this is a philosophical moment, meaning that questions, general questions that we usually pose are now seen more and more under the light of coloniality. It is true that universalism is a narrative of itself, about itself, by Europe that decreed that it is par excellence the natural location of the universal, and as such it has the mission to bring it to the rest of the world. That would be a definition of universalism, a broad definition of universalism. Against that, I would say that that universalism has ended, and I use as a date for its end 1955. The reason for that is not just because it is my anniversary, my date of birth, but it is the moment of the conference of Bandung. And the conference of Bandung, I'll come back to the conference itself, marks really the end of that universalism. It is a symbolic date for the movement of decolonization and a time of what I call an insurrection of the pluralism of the word, the eruption of the hitherto silenced cultures and languages of the word in its diversity onto the stage of universal history as it had been constructed at the end of the 18th century and early 19th century by many philosophers, mainly Hegel. he is the one who constructed philosophical universalism that can be reduced to the following proposition: universal history has a geography and a place, and that is Europe. What remains in this, at the center of it, is the notion of Europe's exceptionalism and election. Universalism, in that sense, whose most complete expression was the construction at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century of the history of philosophy as the manifestation of Europe's exceptionalism and election. So, very briefly, to describe what I call the construction of European universalism philosophically by Hegel, as we know, in his philosophy, he proceeded to an ethnic cleansing of the history of philosophy. Actually, there is a wonderful book published recently in France by Catherine Koenig-Pralong. The title, translated into English, is The Philosophical Colony, Writing the History of Philosophy in the 17th and 19th, in the 18th and 19th century. And it tells the history of, it tells how the history of philosophy became a discipline within the discipline of philosophy and was taught as such. And the importance of the figure of Hegel is that he had the most systematic way of building and constructing that history of philosophy as being what is known by the Latin phrase translatio studii, or translatio studiorum, if you choose the plural, the transmission or translation or transfer, both of those, all those meanings being under translatio. Studiorum, science, basically philosophy, Greek philosophy. So he made translatio studii something exclusively European, which was not a given, because when this very expression translatio studii was forged during medieval times in Europe, somebody like Roger Bacon, known as the Doctor Mirabilis, 13th century, understood translatio studii totally differently. He defined translatio studii as the transmission of, by God, I quote him, I paraphrase what Roger Bacon said, the transmission by God of his laws in Hebrew to the Hebrew people. So basically starting the history of philosophy with the revelation, the Bible. And then he said it went through Greek language with Aristotle. And then he adds it went into Arabic language with Avicenna, Ibn Sina. His name has been Latinized in Avicenna. And said, well, at last we have it now in Latin, but Latin is not really very important. Not many works have been produced in Latin, which is a very strange declaration. We are so used to thinking of Latin as the language of philosophy. Here is a medieval philosopher in the 13th century saying that what is more important than Latin is actually the fact that at one point philosophy was translated, translata, in Arabic, and with people such as Avicenna. So this understanding of translatio studii as having many different geographies and having spoken many different languages was something very important until the time when, at the end of the 18th century, 19th century, the notion of European exceptionalism founded upon the fact that philosophy is exclusively European and at the heart of the European telos was created. Of course, Hegel could not ignore that in the history of philosophy, when you look at it, you have names such as Avicenna or Averroes or Ibn Tufayl or all these names. So he, in order to give a foundation, a solid foundation to that exceptionalism, he had this operator of exclusion, which is the word proper. So Hegel started speaking of philosophy proper. And philosophy proper was a way of excluding everybody else out of the field of philosophy and proceeding with that, what I have called an ethnic cleansing of the history of philosophy. So philosophy proper can only be European. He said that it cannot inhabit a culture where the religion is mere fanaticism, and it cannot also be expressed in a language which is not universal. We see again around that period the use of this notion of universal. What is a universal language? Before, that kind of universalism of languages was turned against all the languages outside of Europe. It was even a problem within Europe itself. The Germans and the French were fighting over the question of which language is more universal. Is it French? Because in French you have the subject matter, the subject, and then you have the action, and then you have the object. And they say, this is the very structure of our reason. And the German would say, no, 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 wait a minute. You can have any kind of order in our language, and so we have the flexibility, which is the essence of reason. So the debate was simply ridiculous, but it was very interesting when we questioned the notion of universalism, and when we look at this debate at the time when European universalism was being manufactured by philosophers such as Hegel. And the connection with colonialism is also obvious when we look at the moment when Hegel was creating that notion of European universalism, because during the time when he was giving his lectures on the history of philosophy in Berlin, early 19th century, and on 1830, he saluted the event, the most important event that year, because that is when France, the French conquered Algiers and started their war against Abdel Qadir al-Jazairi, the Emir Abdel Qadir. So now that is history. In the field of art, this construction of universalism translated into a conception of the history of art in Hegel's philosophy that begins with the Egyptians and the Greeks and the Romans, goes through the Middle Ages and the Renaissance to the Baroque and on to modern and contemporary art. And this is the path of universalism as European exceptionalism laid out by Hegel in his philosophy of art as well. And as put by a Wiss, I quote him, Hegel's philosophy of history was reconstructed as an imaginary museum, and his art history is museum-like. And this is the point. This is why I spent so much time on Hegel. The way in which he translated that European universalism into the history of art was happening at the same time when museums started appearing in Europe, end of 18th century. Well, not appearing, but being open to the public and not just to the kings and queens and princes or the so-called learned man, but really becoming something public. So his thinking about the history of art was a way of designing what a museum should look like. Let me here have a parenthesis about Egyptian art, because one could be surprised to see that Egyptian art is important. For Hegel, Egyptian art is still in the infancy of the spirit. So the whole history, universal history, is the history of the spirit. So the spirit materializes itself and then frees itself and continues the movement of universal history. So in Egyptian art, the spirit does not appear in all its fullness. It remains in a way engulfed and submerged in matter. And for him, this is what explains the stiffness of Egyptian statues, the fact that they have their arms glued to the body, the legs pressed together. One is advancing, but the other one is close by, and they are pressed together. It is, and he is describing that in total contrast with Greek and Roman statuary, where he says you feel the freedom of the spirit. It's unfolding in the sweeping and free gestures of the figures that are represented. So this is somehow what explains why in universal museums you would have Egypt as a starting point, the infancy of that spirit that is going to be fully on display in Greco-Roman statuary. And it is also important to bear in mind that the Egyptians were the first, or among the first, I don't know if the Mesopotamians came first, to have a sense of the body and its proportions as well. So this is the reason why, for Hegel, Egypt cannot belong to the continent it is in, which is Africa. It has to belong to Asia. It is too much a brilliant civilization, and it could be considered as the infancy of the spirit that is going to be really flourishing in Greece to belong to Africa. Again, we see the same operator being used by him, the notion of the proper. So he says Egypt has to be taken out of Africa and attached to Asia. Northern part of Africa is, since it is the south of the Mediterranean Sea, and Mare Nostrum, the Mediterranean Sea, is supposed to be very the matrix of civilization, you have to detach it also from Africa, attach it to Europe, but not on equal footing, obviously. It has to be a colony of Europe, and this is why he saluted 1830, and then remains what he called Africa proper. And that is actually the kind of thinking, the construction of universalism, that the masterpieces now on display in the Pavilion of Sessions, African artifacts in particular, are helping to deconstruct. So that is the one first point I am making. The second point I am making being that the end of universalism should still not be the end of the universal. It should mean the opening of the possibility of something that is at the heart of my work, and that Sarah mentioned, horizontal universal or lateral universal. So this brings me to the point precisely of the history of African art at the Louvre. What does it mean for that form of universalism that at one point African art with oceanic art, also an Amerindian art came into the Louvre in 2000. The arrival of African objects in the Louvre in 2000 was the culmination, after almost a century, of a claim that had been formulated with the utmost force by the poetic and artistic avant-garde in Europe, and France in particular. The artistic avant-garde who campaigned for what I have called my contribution to the neologism surrounding the Louvre, the Louvrization of non-Western art. So in French, when you say Louvrisation, it also immediately reminds people of Panthéonisation, and this is what I meant by this neologism. It looks like to bring a piece, an artifact into the Louvre is the same as bringing a body to the Pantheon. So they campaigned, these avant-garde campaigned for the Louvrisation of non-Western art, and they did it in the name of what these objects meant for the art that was being reborn at the beginning of the 20th century, and what this rebirth of art owed to the aesthetic language offered by African art in particular. And at the forefront of that campaign for the Louvrisation of African artifacts was the poet Guillaume Apollinaire. So allow me to evoke 3 lines of a poem by Apollinaire, a famous poem, Zone, part of his volume Alcool. À la fin, tu es là de ce monde ancien, bergère au Tour Eiffel, le troupeau des ponts belles ce matin, tu en as assez de vivre dans l'Antiquité grecque et romaine. Translation that I found on Google. You've had enough of that old word at last. O Eiffel Tower, shepherd this morning the bridges are a bleating flock. All this Greek and Roman antiquity has exhausted you. I evoke these opening lines of Guillaume Apollinaire's poem Zone in relation to his fights to introduce what was then known as art nègre, Negro art, into the Louvre, and which had enjoyed great vogue in the artistic avant-garde in the late 19th and early 20th century. Because that art represented an escape from the old world, he mentions in his poem, that of Greek and Roman antiquity, which provokes that exhaustion that he evokes as well, outside of which we must seek a source of vivification, that of the few disciplines and civilizations in which universalism would like to confine the only language that speaks to a public like that of the Louvre. Apollinaire's battle can be summed up as follows. Transfer to the Louvre, where they belong, objects that once stripped of their fetish status will be reborn as works of art. In other words, he hated the fact that all these objects, artifacts, had been dumped at the Museum Trocadero, which is the ancestor of Musée Quai Branly, Jacques Chirac, as you know, and just abandoned to the curiosity of people who would look at them as ethnographic objects and not works of art. And it was in this way, for example, that African masks found their way into Picasso's language, very good friend of Guillaume Apollinaire, when they gave their faces to les demoiselles d'Avignon. And I have here, I have here les demoiselles d'Avignon, that you know the original, obviously, because it is at the MoMA in New York, 1906, 1907. Picasso himself, when he talked to a French philosopher and statesman, André Malraux, about Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, famously connected his painting of Les Demoiselles d'Avignon to his visit to the Museum of Trocadero. He said that when he went there and visited and saw all these strange African objects, fetishes, he felt that he needed some kind of exorcism. It looked like something very strange for him and even painful, his experience of being among those objects, although he was himself collecting also a few African artifacts and masks in particular. But he said that when he made that visit to the Trocadero Museum, This is, he believes, the day when the Demoiselles d'Avignon were really fully thought, because until then he had been trying many different faces and he was not happy with the faces. The bodies of these ladies were fine, but the faces, he was looking for them, and he decided at the end to use masks for these faces. It is not the only work by him that where you see African masks. His self-portrait of that same year, 1906, gives himself the face of a mask, and the same goes for the portrait of Gertrude Stein that he painted later. And this is the reason why for Apollinaire, these objects needed to be transferred to their rightful place, and they would teach the Louvre public something about getting out of the exhaustion from Greco-Roman antiquity. In other words, Louvreization meant the decentering out of a universalism closed on its own and on its European definition towards another universal that these artifacts helped to invent. It is important, I believe, to remember that these African artifacts did not remain silent and inert in these places where they were just waiting in exile. I was discussing earlier with my good friend Andreas about this beautiful movie by French-Senegalese Mati Diop, Dahomey, where she is documenting the return, the restitution of Benin artifacts from the Republic of Benin that were at the Musée du Quai Branly to Benin. The only thing I mean, in the movie, for those who have seen it, it's a wonderful, beautiful movie. The objects speak, the works of art speak, and whenever they speak, the screen is just dark. And what they are saying is that they are living in this long night of exile, waiting for their liberation when they get back home. I don't think, and the whole point is precisely to say that no, these objects did not remain silent and inert. They had agency. They acted. They were life forces out of the cosmology that gave birth to them. And that life force is what they invested when they spoke with these avant-garde artists, when they spoke with Picasso, when Picasso actually met what he was looking for in the visual language brought by these objects. So this agency is something very important, and I believe that the discourse about restitution should be taken that into consideration as well. So I close that parenthesis to talk about now the fact that more than 80 years after the poet Apollinaire's death, and more than 25 years after the death of his friend Picasso, the struggle for the Louvreization has had the outcome represented by the decision taken at the turn of the century by President Jacques Chirac to make the Pavillon des Sessions the home of the artifacts that can be seen there. It is important to mention that, and the action taken by Jacques Chirac. He believed in what was called at the time when he decided that they should be going to the Pavillon des Sessions, they were called primitive art, and then the primitive was abandoned for first, art premier in French, first arts, like we say, we talk about first people, and just Pavillon des Sessions, les œuvres du Pavillon des Sessions. And because Jacques Chirac of course, in France, where everything comes from the state, it had to be a presidential decision. But it was not just as president that he made that decision. It was also as a man who knew about art premier and who had a vision about art premier being part of the universal narrative of so-called Universal Museum. So that was the meaning of his gesture, the sampling of few objects from the Musée du Quai Branly to be taken to Louvre and Pavillon des Sessions. We can draw a parallel here with what happened to the Metropolitan Museum, the Met. The Met earlier, in this so-called primitive art, went to the Met earlier, in the late 1950s, I believe, but this time it was the vision of Nelson Rockefeller, who is the one who started the Department of African Arts at the Metropolitan Museum. Not in his capacity as a politician, but as a man of vision as well. It is important to mention that here we have billionaires who have vision about public good and not otherwise. So the move made by President Jacques Chirac, it is important to mention that it was opposed by the then president of the Louvre, Pierre Rosenberg, who had this declaration to make against Jacques Chirac. The Louvre is not a universal museum. It simply covers a few civilizations, a few disciplines. Paris is a universal museum, not the Louvre. The Arts of Africa, Asia, Oceania, and the Americas department, housed in the Pavillon des Sessions, is not a museum. It is a sampling of very fine objects that would be better off at the Musée du Quai Branly Jacques Chirac, which needs these masterpieces even though they teach the Louvre public nothing. So it was important and interesting for me to see the use again of the word universal. This time protesting that the Louvre is not universal and therefore cannot accommodate non-European art, which is rich, as the saying goes, because actually that definition of art being European is the very definition of universalism. So turning the table, so to say, and using universal to say no to these objects coming in was important. And taking out of the word this art meant basically that you consider Europe to be the location of the universal, but the location of the Europe has to be not just continental Europe, but also all the dominions, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, etc. So praising that form of, that spirit of Europe rather than the continental Europe is what Pierre Rosenberg had in mind when he was trying to refuse those objects entering his Louvre. But obviously, Jacques Chirac being president and he being appointed by Jacques Chirac, decision came to have these objects in le Pavillon des Sessions. But it is interesting to remember this idea that Europe is supposed to be a spiritual telos rather than a continental reality. And that is the reason why the expansion of Europe, the expansion of universalism could mean transforming other dominions into a way of prolonging Europe and turning the populations in those places into aboriginal minorities whose cultural works must be kept out of the museum according to the definition of a non-universal Louvre by Pierre Rosenberg. And to say that Paris may be a universal museum but not the Louvre is in fact just to say that universalism can only be Europe while the rest of the words is engulfed in particularisms. So Louvreization of African art and the arts of the other 4 continents, which was first and foremost the struggle of poets before it was achieved by a presidential decision, has signified the deconstruction of European universalism in museums such as the Louvre and the Met, and a reflection of the deconstruction of European universalism in the 20th century art history. Immanuel Wallenstein has declared that our times mark the end of European universalism. Our times meaning after Bandung. And he has added that that means the task of forging a truly universal universalism. And I consider that to mean what French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty has called a horizontal universal or a lateral universal. In order to understand what is that, let me mention another philosopher who opposed any idea of lateralism of the universal, and that philosopher is Emmanuel Levinas. We like to think of Emmanuel Levinas as the philosopher of the other, of the transcendent other, whose face commands me, tells you will not kill, you will be hospitable, you will be welcoming, etc., which is true. The ethical turn in philosophy by Emmanuel Levinas is really, truly very important. But one cannot ignore a book he wrote titled Humanisme de l'autre homme, Humanism of the Other, in which the philosopher of the other that he is becomes someone else in the name of universalism and European exceptionalism. Emmanuel Levinas, in that book, summarized very quickly, indicate why only Europe can be the location of universalism and has the mission of bringing universalism to the rest of the world. Europe is uniquely at the vertical of the universal, like as if the universal were these Platonic ideas and Europe was situated at the vertical of these, because verticality for him is a crucial dimension of universality. You cannot have universality if you do not have verticality, and that verticality belongs to Europe. So that verticality actually evokes the image of a lighthouse. Europe is like a lighthouse that has to enlighten the rest of the world and bring universalism to the rest of the world. So now that we live in a world that is decolonized, as Levinas says, let's make sure that this de-occidentalization doesn't mean de-orientation, disorientation. He is, that play on words is not mine, it is Levinas playing on words. So this is what he writes about that. And in the same text, he attacked Merleau-Ponty's notion of a lateral universal as being totally oxymoric. Universalism cannot be lateral, it can only be vertical. And that is where actually I came, this is in the 1980s, that I came across Levinas' text at first, which infuriated me, and led me to going to see what Merleau-Ponty said, since Levinas was attacking Merleau-Ponty and denying the notion that you can have any kind of lateral or horizontal dimension to universality. What was Merleau-Ponty saying? This is something he says in many different places, and especially in the volume he published under the title Science, and in particular an article on from Mauss to Levi-Strauss, that is the title of the article. And he says, this is not the time anymore of an overarching universal, of precisely the vertical universalism. This is a time, he says, of lateral universal. And the notion of lateral universal comes from the idea that a post-Bandung world is a word where all cultures are on the same plane of immanence, bless you, and all languages are on that same plane of immanence. The only communication possible between languages and cultures becomes then horizontal. You have no dimension of verticality. So if something like universalism has to be constructed, it has to be constructed laterally, not as overarching, but as oblique or lateral or horizontal. All those words are to be found in Merleau-Ponty. So acknowledging that we now live in a world, in that post-Bandung world, where the vertical overarching universal is simply not possible anymore, but where we now need to aim for lateral universal based on plurality, encounter, and reciprocity. This is a long quote, but I need probably to quote it at length, the passage from Merleau-Ponty on those two types of universal. The equipment, he writes, of our social being can be dismantled and reconstructed by the voyage, as we are able to learn to speak other languages. This provides a second way to the universal, no longer the overarching universal of a strictly objective method, but a sort of lateral universal which we acquire through ethnological experience and its incessant testing of the self through the other person and the other person through the self. It is a question of constructing a general system of reference in which the point of view of the native, the point of view of the civilized man, and the mistaken views each has of the other can all find a place. That is, of constituting a more comprehensive experience which becomes, in principle, accessible to men of a different time and country. Ethnology is not a specialty defined by a particular object, primitive societies. It is a way of thinking, the way which imposes itself when the object is different and requires us to transform ourselves. We also become the ethnologist of our own society if we set ourselves at a distance from it. I thought this passage to be central, and it has been central to my own work on what the meaning of universalism, a truly universal universalism after the end of universalism, would mean. I emphasize in particular the invitation to travel, that is to decenter oneself by learning the existence of other places, but also decentering oneself by learning other languages. And in particular, this idea that universalism, the universal that is going to be forged by all cultures, equivalent cultures, equal cultures, situated on the same horizontal plane, are going to forge together, that universal supposes the capacity of decentering. And travel is a form of decentering, but even more, learning other languages, getting out of your own language, not saying anymore, as Heidegger, following Husserl and following Hegel, said that the language of philosophy is Greek. Philosophy speaks Greek, or Indo-European language, a language that would be characterized by the presence of the verb to be. This idea that the verb to be is the foundation of ontology, Western ontology and Western philosophy, that is what Merleau-Ponty is questioning here. You have to learn other languages, because if you do not know another language, as Goethe famously said, you do not know your own language. If I don't have a perspective on my own language, I know nothing about my language. And the only outside of a language is another language. That is the only way in which I can see how my language is a particular, creates a particular relationship between the word and myself. And that passage also emphasizes the fact that the word is plural, woven of different equivalent cultures and languages. And that we have to undergo in this word, in this post-Bandung word, the test of translation, the test of our capacity to think from language to language and to encounter inevitably the untranslatable as well. And this is precisely what a truly universal museum does. Put in visual form the experience of the lateral universal that we acquire, to represent that general system of reference within which different perspectives take place that Merleau-Ponty was talking about. And in this way, we have to avoid confining other arts to a ghetto, either the ghetto of saying, well, they do not belong here. My museum is not universal if by universal you mean to bring me these foreign objects. But within the Louvre itself, they do not need also to be in a ghetto, which had been the case until now. I don't know, you may be familiar with the Louvre, maybe not familiar with the Pavillon des Sessions, and that would be, there would be a reason to that. The Pavillon des Sessions is really decentered, not in the positive sense that I'm using here, but just doesn't seem to belong to the Louvre itself. There is no way a wanderer, a flaneur, as Baudelaire or Benjamin would say, would come across African art. If you do not look for it, you are not going to come across it, because it is just... and today, actually, the Musée du Louvre is reconfiguring everything, redesigning, let me use that word, everything, breaking walls, mainly, compartmentalizing these objects in such a way that you would have truly this lateral universal coming together. These objects would be speaking to each other because they would not be separated physically. But at the same time, they would be really, truly speaking to each other across spaces and across time as well. And like this, and this is the final image I want to look at. This is le Louvre Lens, another Louvre, which is not Louvre Abu Dhabi. Louvre now is 3 places, locations: Louvre in Paris, Louvre Abu Dhabi, and Louvre Lens. And Louvre Lens has this configuration, this design of the objects that I have, and they call it La Marche du Temps. In La Marche du Temps, you just go chronologically and you meet different objects, different artifacts belonging to different cultures. So what it means is that if you go across this museum, if you go through these objects, you navigate, you find your way between these objects, you are going to have a sense of translation. You could think of the Mona Lisa speaking, for example, to an African mask. Her smile and the impassive face of a mask. Or you can have also across time objects speaking to each other. This is a small scale, of course. You cannot imagine the big Louvre doing the same thing. But the spirit is that one. The spirit is truly to deconstruct the universalism of the museum à la Hegel and come to this form of universal. And I believe, I hope I have given you reasons to accept the adjective lateral or horizontal or oblique to characterize that form of universalism and that form of dialogue of cultures. Thank you very much for your attention. With great pleasure.
So I I was thinking to myself, oh, I'm going to be able to bring up the Louvre Lens and how it actually does what you're saying. And you stole that question that I had prepared. So you sort of stole that thunder from me. But I will say, so there is another part, it's a fantastic ending, and it is a fantastic museum. There are two things. One is it's also a rotating collection. They change up the pieces that are in that display, so you're constantly then reminded of other conversations, right? But the other thing is that you've often talked about a horizon, not just the horizontal of the universal, but a horizon of the universal, sort of that as if it's something that there's a sort of a horizon that you can never fully attain. And so I wanted to address that, one, to ask you if it is something that you think is attainable or if it's always going to be a future project. But also with the example of the Louvre Lens, the reflectivity gives this sense of a kind of perpetual mirroring of this relationship that you're talking about. So there's a sense of not just the horizontal, and there is a slight slope at Lens, but also the reflectivity in the horizon. So I wondered if you could talk about the horizon.
Absolutely, and the connection comes from the word education. My idea is that when museums engage with this form of reconfiguration, first of all, open themselves up to something different from the Egyptians and the Greeks to nowadays, they open themselves to that, and they open themselves to what the Louvre Lens is trying to put together. They are actually educating the public to a notion of our shared humanity. La Marche du Temps has that aim for me and that meaning. When I visited it most recently, couple of months ago, I had that feeling that this is something I can imagine a teacher bringing their students and giving them a sense of our shared humanity through these objects being put together and the conversation that they have across time and across differences. Because this is where horizon is important. We have to project ourselves on that horizon of universality. This is why I was joking and making fun of myself, saying that I am very passé in that sense. I do believe in universalism, and I do not want it to be replaced by all these pluriversality, diversality. I can understand the insistence on the plural. I can understand the opposition to an imperial, neo-colonial, or colonial form of universalism. But the idea that to be post-colonial is to be particularist versus universalism that is imperial, etc., is absurd. People who fought the fight of colonialism against colonialism fought in the name of a universal. What kind of universal is that? What kind of universal are we looking for after colonization is much more important than saying anytime someone pronounces the word universal, you just jump on your chair and start screaming. And that is what is important with this idea of having museums play the role of bringing different cultures together and making sure that they are not just compartmentalized, but they speak to each other. Obviously, if you are a flaneur in a museum, you are going to make some rapprochement. You are going to see in a very unexpected way a conversation being built between an object that you have seen in one gallery with another object in another gallery. And having that sense of the communication of human creativity, human imaginary, goes against the fragmentation that we are witnessing today. We live in a very tribalized world. And we have to get out of the logic of tribalism and get out of the idea that cultures are just running on parallel lanes and that the worst that could happen to a culture is to be mixed with another culture. We are in that kind of generalized apartheid today in the way in which we approach identities and cultures and so on and so forth. So the aim, which is behind what I was trying to do, is precisely that. Having a sense of lateral universal in a museum is a way of projecting ourselves towards a horizon of universality. The idea that we are one single humanity is something we have to hold at this time. The virus of COVID knows that we are one single humanity in a way that we do not know. So we have to learn it from it and learn to respond from it. So thank you for bringing this horizon as well.
So I have two other questions before I open it up to our audience, so start thinking of questions afterwards. So one is, we're at a moment when, certainly in the university, we've opened up from human culture to embrace cultures of all living things, right? So this is something that I think is sort of pushing at your prioritization of the human. And so I wondered if you could respond to that.
Yeah, I do. Kind of work I do when I look at African cosmologies also is go in that direction of this idea that the humanism, in a way, that I'm calling for is the humanism of all living beings, not just human beings. One difference I would have with hardcore people who are against any kind of form of anthropocentrism is that I don't believe in human being the center. But, or let me put it this way, the way in which I understand the centrality of what it means to be human among the living is it is a centrality of responsibility. On a negative sense, meaning that we are responsible for what is happening to our planet, and on a positive sense, meaning that we have the responsibility of fixing it. And that is the meaning of what it, being human as well. This is the side, the Islamic philosophy side of my thinking. That is the meaning that I give to the Islamic notion of Khalif. Human being is the Khalif of God, meaning that he, upon earth, meaning that he or she has to take care of it. And that is the only centrality of the human that I insist on, the centrality of responsibility. And I know many friends who think that this is, again, being true anthropocentric.
I have another question, which is that you are very comfortable with the term African and the sort of the division of categories into the continents. And we were together in Senegal, where we heard a group of young, diverse African architects speaking. And I was so struck by how different their worlds were, even how different their journeys to Dakar were. From their different sites in Africa. Mm-hmm. And so I wonder about the maybe it's a shorthand simply of collecting all of that diversity into the singularity of Africa that you then pose against the European continent.
Yeah, I mean, this is one thing that we now, thanks God, understand fully is that Africa is not a country. So the diversity of the African continent is something that we are is now really part of what people are saying. So avoid essentialism is great, but this doesn't mean that one cannot construct an essence. And this is where I am a Husserlian. In a way, I do believe in the construction of essences. In other words, if I say African art in the singular, okay, anthropologists who have spent their life actually generalizing about Africa, you know, they set foot in a certain place and say Africa in general. Now they are just coming back from that, and they are eager to fragment the continent. Say, oh no, you cannot speak about African art. You have to speak about Dogon art, Senufo art, art from the Ujamaa in Tanzania. Yes. But then, even if you say Dogon art, no, but maybe this village and that village, and you go, because you do not want to generalize, you go to a point where you singularize so much, you individualize so much that you cannot say anything anymore. As Aristotle said, there is no science of the singular. You have to have some form of generality in order to start having some science. So you construct African art. That is, the mistake would be just to assume that there is such a thing as African art. If I constructed the way, for example, Leopold Sédar Senghor did, what he said is, I am looking at one common denominator, which is the fact that they turned their back on mimesis. It looks like the artist will not try to represent reality as it appears, but something he called sub-reality. And so this is a way of constructing African art on a clearly stated basis. But again, it is important to take into account fully the pluralism and the diversity of this huge continent with I don't know how many languages, many landscapes, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
I open the floor, or I open the opportunity to the floor. Michael.
So we've stipulated that Louvre Lens is a good diagram for the horizontal universality. So let's stay there. I also just want to appreciate how much. Tell you how much I appreciate the whole presentation and your coming here. I really appreciate that. But I want to pick a little bit at the humanism of the universality, and I'm channeling a little bit mainly our doctoral students and some of our master students who are interested in historiography. They would say, they would ask you about microhistory and why doesn't, and I think part of their interest in microhistory is sharing your interest in, let's say, the diversity of art, but not sharing your interest in universality. And I'm thinking of people from a very similar position, Ernesto Laclau, Judith Butler, all the people that would agree with the horizontality without the universality. So I want to just try one thing. When you were describing the Louvre Lens, I was actually thinking of Edouard Glissant's Creole Garden. And it's very similar kind of, well, let's just say the word, rhizomatic connectivity of unlike things. And yet he would insist that for it to work for his diagram, everything in there is a trace and a trace of a trace. So context is completely complicated and goes away as a determinant. My sense is that for you, context, you still need context, which blocks the universality a little bit because of the humanism, which leads to an interest in identity. And for me, the whole issue of identity and art's relationship to identity is so problematic against any kind of paradigm of universality. So what I was thinking was, could something like the horizontal and the vertical be the difference in a philosophical universality and a political universality? Because I don't think you can get a political universality of the kind that we are in accord with, that we seem to be in accord with, a kind of rhizomatic horizontal universality. I don't think it will go through with the identity politics and the humanism.
Well, thank you so much. Important question. let me start with an anecdote. The very year when he passed, is the year when Edouard Glissant invited me to give a lecture at his Institut du Tout Monde in Paris. And so I gave a lecture along the lines of what I have said here, you know, defending universal and humanism. And I had a Q&A with the members of the Institut du Tout Monde. And then Edouard, at the end, very nicely said, you know, I like what you had to say. I agree with most of what you had to say. But why do you insist on still keeping the word universal? Why keep the word universal? And so that was exactly it. And as you know well, he prefers the word relation. And actually, relation goes as a couple. The couple of concept is relation et opacité. So, nos opacités ouvertes. Nos opacités ouvertes à la relation. Our opacities are still open to relation. And so I like that figure of it. I do not think that I am forcing it too much by reading in that opacité ouverte à la relation a form of lateralism as I am looking for it. And it is important, of course, to preserve the pluralism, to insist, as Edouard Glissant did, on opacité, because of course, what you do not want is, in the name of this universalism or lateral universality, etc., it becomes the old story of, you know, homogenization, uniformization by racialized late capitalism today. And this is why opacity was important for Edouard Glissant. And so opacity is not going against relation, it is on the contrary the condition of relation. The way in which untranslatability can be seen as a condition of translation. Translation always meets untranslatable. Every single language is opaque in that sense, that it is a particular relationship to the word. And in a way, as Merleau-Ponty says, translation should not be possible, but at the end it always happens. It means that we find our way around the untranslatable. As my good friend Barbara Cassin says, the untranslatable is not something that you cannot translate. It is something that you never end translating. And so that form of connection between relation and opacité, I try to think of it in this rhizomatic way, trying to avoid the form of atavism that Edouard Glissant was very much against, this identity as a root. You do not have these big roots as your identity, but the kind of rhizome. And in reality, to tell you everything, the philosopher that is more convincing for me about that is Leibniz. Leibniz's monadology, the idea of monads that have no windows or doors, as he puts it, but nevertheless communicate in that general form of monadology, I would be happy to look at that model as a model of what I'm trying to say about universalism. Now, you are absolutely right. We can understand philosophically this lateralism, but translation, political translation, is another thing. Normally, the political realization of what I'm trying to say would be multilateralism. And actually, the location for that would be the United Nations that are going to be destroyed, I believe, by the new Republican Party. But, and it is just, when you say that, oh, United Nations, they cannot stop wars, they cannot, but that is all what we have. The only place where we have all these cultures and languages coming together is precisely that. So the impossibility of translating this politically means that we have to work on the multilateral translation of the lateral universal and believe in something that would be the very spirit of United Nations, a way of giving the United Nations a constitution that would say, we the people, but we the people would truly be we the peoples of the earth. Cosmopolitanism, I try to.
Anna Maria?
Thank you. I think I have a similar question asked a different way as another fan of Glissant. Just taking this image as a guide. You started the talk by saying we're in a moment of post-colonialism, but many would argue we are not, that we are in conditions of economic and political coloniality that are still very much present. All these objects were created under different political circumstances of more or less power, coloniality, empire. Don't we risk erasing those conditions that produced them by trying to, by advocating for a horizontal universality? Isn't the risk to lose that context and acknowledge that was there and is still here? Mm-hmm.
It is the crux. Sorry. It is precisely the point where a curator of a museum or a designer, I don't know what their name is, would have a problem, because you want at the same time to make sure that these objects that are living together in your general space are not compartmentalized. But at the same time, you do not want them to lose their opacity, to come back to the conversation I had with Michael earlier about Edouard Glissant. And how do you do that? How do you turn that into the configuration or the design of your own museum? Playing with the object itself, the text that accompanies it. I mean, you can translate it into very technical, practical questions, knowing exactly what you do not want to lose. You do not want to lose the context. You do not want to lose the opacity of the object. And at the same time, you want to give meaning to the fact that they live together. They are roommates, if your museum can be considered your room. I would translate, do I translate correctly your question then, doing that? Just a precision before you take the floor again. When I say we live in a post-colonial moment, I'm not saying that colonialism is ended. On the contrary, coloniality is very much alive and well. It is the fact that philosophically we think about the coloniality in everything that we do. In other words, precisely, we are more conscious that, knowledge is also about power, as you mentioned. So that vigilance that we have, I was almost going to say wokeism, but just remembering that woke means vigilance in English. I don't know how you say vigilance in English otherwise, but is what I call the post-colonial moment. Philosophically, we cannot be just so ignorant about the coloniality which is inherent in many different aspects of power relations, etc., etc.
I think we have time for one more, please.
Hi, Professor Bachir Diagne, thank you so much for a wonderful, really wonderful presentation. I think I particularly love this image that you bring here. I'm interested, let me come in by way of anecdote. So myself, thinking about the question of our cosmologies, thinking about our relationship to materialities. I once myself did a lecture at the National Archives or National Museums of Zimbabwe in Bulawayo, particularly thinking about our relationship to colonial photography and that kind of thing in the 19th century or late 19th century Zimbabwe or colonial Zimbabwe at the time. And one of the critiques that I had at the time from members of the audience was to say, well, so much of what you're speaking to is reliant on the colonial archive. Where are we in what you're speaking to? So i.e., I'm referring to particular figures, anti-colonial figures, but through them speaking through the colonial archive, right? So looking through the archival record as rendered through the colonial record, right? And so in the moment I was a little bit stumped, but one of our late great cultural historians, Patisa Nyati, then responded, he intervened and said, well, how many of you have seen Iwisa Lengosi, meaning the sort of staff of the king? Right, meaning King Lobengula of the time, who was the last king of Zimbabwe, who had been who disappeared after the first colonial war. And he was saying, well, everyone was very much stumped, and he says, you haven't seen it because when the British or the settler colonial authorities came in and began the war, they burnt the Great Enclosure. They themselves, and Ndebele people, burnt the Great Enclosure, which is why you have never seen that. If you're going to see it, you must go to the British Museum. So for years, I kept thinking about this around a particular relationship to materiality, that it was not that the colonial authorities burnt it, they themselves burnt the Great Enclosure of the king, right? The palace of the king. They burned down their own settlement. And then I began to do research around the idea that actually within Nguni cultures in Southern Africa, the practice of burning down happens whenever you have the death of a king, for example, or the exhaustion of the environment and you move to a new place. Which is then to say that they have a different relationship to materiality, a different relationship to permanence. Right? So if you want to then have access to many of the artifacts, you would have gone to something that was stolen by a colonial authority and put into a museum, but they themselves did not have that kind of relationship of permanence to their object for many different reasons. That's a whole different lecture in of itself. That was really important for me to think through around our own obsession and need for things to always be permanent. Is this something that we also have to strive for ourselves, right? The idea being that you would burn things amongst other reasons as a way of being in harmony or in rhythm with nature, right? You're not seeking to impose yourself on the landscape, which might be different from Great Zimbabwe, which is its own relationship to permanence. But the idea being that there are different ideas and relationships to materiality that the museum itself calls into question, and what happens when you bring these objects that were not supposed to be permanent in the first place into these museums in the name of universality.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that comment, which is great. And actually, it made me think of an example I'm more familiar with, which is the famous throne of the Bamoun from Cameroon. It was evoked recently when the current Sultan of the Bamoun went to the Humboldt Museum in Berlin, and when he was presented with the throne of his grandfather, he sat on it. The idea being, well, this is mine. So it should be restituted to the Bamoun. But then when you know the history of those thrones, what happens is that whenever a new sultan is established on the throne, he sits on the throne of his father. That is, when he becomes sultan. After that, he has to design his own throne. And you can destroy the old one. So meaning what you were saying about this idea of generation, continuity in the fact that he is established first on the throne of the previous sultan, but he has to have his own throne as well. And this goes against the very idea of keeping, etc., which was, by the way, opposed by directors who refused any kind of idea of restitution, saying that we saved these by putting them in our museum. Otherwise, they would have been destroyed either on purpose or just because Africa is not safe for anything. Anyway, it is a location of destruction and death, and so on. But things are different. Today, we want to keep things. We want to have these archives. And this is why actually the so-called colonial library, as Valentin Mudimbe famously said, is still a library, meaning that we have to go through it in a way in order to recapture our own history as well. So reinventing the museum is also somehow going against a tradition of, yes, considering that these objects might die because it is the cycle of life and new masks have to be created and manufactured, and etc. Thank you.
So I will say I'm still stumped on how you are going to translate the term universalisé, which for your title. So that's your and Judith's problem for the English version of this essay. But thank you for giving us so much fodder to mull over, and for this horizon of a possible shared commitment to our shared humanity. Thank you very much.
Thank you.